My name's Patricia Schuba, and I live in eastern Franklin County. My family has lived here for the last 150 years. We have several family farms, and we're very concerned about this issue with data centers that cropped up in January of this year. And looked to our neighbors, and a group of neighbors got together to start talking about what we could do to influence the process. My background is in healthcare, and I have a lot of concerns about how these data centers impact health, impact air pollution, and a series of other things, not to mention impacts on agriculture and the land. So it was in January of this year that we first heard about the data centers. A group of people who lived near the two sites received the obligatory cards in the mail, the postcards in the mail that said there was going to be maybe some changes to zoning near to them. And like Franklin County normally is, we're a network of communities. We got out the word about that, and a whole building full of people showed up to the January hearing of the Franklin County Planning and Zoning Committee to support our neighbors who are concerned about this. And that's the first that we heard about it. The way that county government works is that the Planning and Zoning Committee, which is made up of 11 township representatives who are serving as volunteers and appointed by the county commission, gathered to look at zoning changes that are proposed by the planning and zoning director. And the director is hired by the county commission. So we think it's important for the community to understand how these changes come about. Someone or an entity comes to the county and requests a change in zoning to allow them to build something that they want to build. So evidently, the developers and or the local utility came to the county and said, we have nothing in our code that would allow these data centers to operate in Franklin County. So as a result, the planning and zoning director and potentially other people started crafting these zoning code regulation changes. And that's all happening behind the scenes where the public's not made aware of that. They can be made aware of that if you have an open, engaged commission, but that did not happen here in Franklin County. So the first we heard about it was in January. At the end of January, Planning and Zoning sent out the cards to people closest to the two locations that were already being negotiated. And then we had a hearing about that January, I think it was 27th or 28th. And a lot of people showed up and showed a lot of concern over this. And the Planning and Zoning Committee decided that they weren't okay with moving forward with changing the zoning codes and decided to vote to table the initiative for 6 months. And that was after even considering a moratorium. And the planning and zoning director suggested that they take a different tact because that would require getting approval from the commission to have a hearing on a moratorium. So they put the 6-month tabling of the issue, which gave the community some relief in the thought that they're going to review everything that we provided to them over the next 6 months. And part of that was to look for expert opinions to advise them on how to proceed. And so we thought there was 6 months and the potential for expert input. A group of us came to the meeting in February. The Planning and Zoning Committee meets monthly at scheduled times. So we went to that meeting just to see what was going to be talked about. And little did we anticipate, the Planning and Zoning Committee took up the issue immediately and started talking about the zoning code regulation changes and potentially voting. And what they did at that meeting is they concluded in setting a hearing, because there has to be a public hearing of the issue. And they felt like the hearing that happened in January was probably not sufficient. And we would agree with that. There was probably more than 800 people at that hearing. They were in the room, in the hallway, down the stairs, in the atrium, and even outside the building. And many of those people came to testify, and they weren't given the opportunity to testify, which under state law, they're required to be heard. And the committee, in this case, the Planning and Zoning Committee, needs to consider their input in any decisions that they make. And that was in February. They decided then that they had to set a new hearing, and that would be in March, and that was March 17th. So that was only a few weeks ago. That meeting was held at the Union High School, and 1,000 people attended that hearing, which was astonishing, but not surprising to the public. And we had 174 people who testified, and I'd say 99% of those were against opening the Franklin County zoning code in unincorporated Franklin County to data centers, and certainly hyperscale data centers, which are larger centers that manage the data for AI in areas that were sensitive environmentally, that were close to residences' homes, and were in non-industrial areas of the county. So I think there might have been maybe 5 to 10 people who testified for the zoning code changes. And predominantly those were people who stood to benefit in some way from allowing data centers in the county. So potentially they could have contracts for work, or they were actually the developers themselves who testified. And that was in March. And so currently, we're waiting to hear in March, April, what the Planning and Zoning Committee will do. And they have the option to vote to recommend or not to recommend. So it's important to understand how these bodies operate. So the Planning and Zoning Committee is appointed individuals from each township, and they operate as an advisory committee to the commission. So their goal is to gather all the information to decide what is within the master plan of a county for zoning and development, and to actually make recommendations for those zoning amendments. So they do the meat and potatoes of deciding what is put in different parts of the county and what that looks like. And it's important to understand that they only have zoning authority over unincorporated Franklin County, not the cities that operate separately within the county. So they look over all that information. They rewrite what the planning and zoning director may have proposed from their perspectives, from their township perspectives, taking information from the public and from experts. And then they either recommend or not recommend that to the 3 county commissioners, who are a legislative body. They're the 3 people that voters in the county of Franklin County elect every 2 to 4 years. And those 3 people then will set their own hearing, take more information from the public, put it back on the Planning and Zoning Committee and their attorney to rewrite any portions of those regulations, and then pass or not pass those codes into county zoning law. And we're anticipating that may happen in as early as 14 days after passage from the Planning and Zoning Committee. It's crucial to understand Planning and Zoning Committee works up the regulations and makes those reflect the desires and will of the public, as well as in keeping with the master plan and planning documents for the county. And unless they make a decision, the county commissioners cannot move forward. And that the county commissioners are a legislative body, not a court. If the commissioners, after their own hearing, pass regulations into law in the county, and citizens in the county still disagree, they have the option to take a lawsuit to the Planning and Zoning Adjustment Committee. And that actually operates like a court. So there's a series of steps that we go through, and the citizens have input at each level of those decision-making processes. But it's really important that we show up and we're prepared to give input at the right point in time